the IEO webinar on the IMF's mandate. Our speaker today is John Hicklin, who should be will be known to most of you, Deputy Director of the IEO, as well as a senior staff member in other departments in the IMF. Just a few house rules: when you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute so that we don't have background noise. My colleague Nicoletta Bettini is jumping over from another event, so she should be here and moderating the event. So I'll turn it over now to John, and let me see if I can share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, I hope people can see it. John, you can see it?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, over to you then. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Prakash and Nicoletta, when she appears. Thank you for the invitation. My motivation is to encourage the IMF to do much more to bolster a system of international cooperation that is struggling, just when we need it most. I view the challenge from three angles. First, the delays in coming up with a strategy to end the global pandemic constitutes a major, this is slide one, Prakash, end the global pandemic. It's a major failure of international cooperation. It is a wake-up call, the proverbial canary in the coal mine. It does not augur well for dealing with the urgent and complex issues of climate change and threats to biodiversity. A second perspective comes as I imagine sitting together in 2045, the IMF's 100th anniversary, at the end of a tumultuous quarter century for the planet, and asking the question, how well did the IMF do its job in the years following the year 2020? Should it have done more with its 2020 foresight on the risk of irreversible harm by mid-century? Some detect hope, positive zeitgeist, a phrase I heard recently in the news by governments and corporations, but action has so far been woefully insufficient on climate change and biodiversity. Third, I would ask whether the evaluation framework could be strengthened when very dramatic changes are predicted and the world economy faces such huge risks. I will leave this issue for possible Q&A. I touch on three areas: pandemic response, climate change, and biodiversity. In each of them, the IMF has only a limited but still important role. Perhaps most strikingly, in each case, timing is of the essence. Short delays in pandemic response cost many lives and huge economic loss. And on climate change and biodiversity, delays meeting the objectives set in other international fora risk catastrophic and irreversible change. Discussions of mandate have to be placed in the context of extraordinary change since World War II. In broad sweep, the IMF's stated purpose to facilitate expansion and balanced growth of international trade and to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment and real income has been fulfilled beyond any post-war dreams. In slide 2, we see world trade has increased by some 30-fold. In slide 3, the world has seen spectacular growth. The left panel portrays the great wave of per capita income, as I call it. Per capita income growth from 1950, with more than 44 countries shown at the top of the panel, passing the high income threshold, and many others also making rapid economic progress. Such success brings major new challenges for the world. The right-hand panel shows the same per capita income data over time in absolute levels for the same 140 countries and reveals the present inequity between countries, the huge divergence between the richest, some now 30 to 100 times the income levels of the poorest, mainly in Africa, shown in red, which now have no foreseeable chance of convergence. Slide 4, the second challenge arises from the population boom, a tripling since 1950, a triumph of policy and science. Macroeconomic policy will have to contend with this, whether or not the population continues to expand to 2100 or decline sharply, as some now think likely. But now on top of these and other challenges, we have to deal with even more pressing economic and geopolitical consequences of the such rapid growth of trade, income and population. Pandemics, climate change, and diminished biodiversity. So slide 5. Concentrating on whether the mandate is fit for purpose to deal with these, I address three questions and then conclude with a suggested way forward. First, what role does the IMF mandate play in gaining legitimacy and being effective? Second, the IMF needs to act quickly and change substantively to play its part in a renewed collaborative effort. What can be done without a change in mandate? And third, I suggest four specific ideas for modifying the mandate, two straightforward, two much more speculative, as a means of debate. Slide 6. So what role does the mandate play? First, it provides a clear legal justification for each IMF activity. The origin lies in the post-war architecture, when each organization had a specialized role to play toward the overall purpose to enhance human welfare and maintain peace. The IMF's Articles of Agreement sets out the purposes for which the fund's powers are being granted, all only of an economic nature. And then it outlines the specific powers granted to the IMF, which include the powers of oversight, provision of financial assistance, and advisory powers. So the mandate has elements of what the IMF should do, cannot do, and can do. For example, the IMF shall exercise firm surveillance over exchange rate policies. It shall adopt policies on lending subject to safeguards, but it may provide technical assistance if requested. The second point is that the mandate is not rigid. Flexibility is central to the IMF being the living organism it is today, and how it can be effective tomorrow. The articles have been amended 7 times, so the purposes of the IMF, the key mission statement set out succinctly in Article 1, is remarkably robust and remains essentially unchanged. Crucially, the IMF Executive Board was given the authority to adopt policies to provide specific content to the powers given to the IMF. The third point is that given any given mandate, the IMF budget and the priorities management sets on the limits the scope of what the IMF can accomplish, the depth with which it pursues its obligatory tasks, and the amount and quality of the tasks it chooses to do. These optional tasks can be very substantial. For example, capacity development now comprises about 1/3 of IMF activity. Slide 7. Whatever the mandate, the IMF effectiveness depends on maintaining a moral authority or the normative consensus, as Pauly and others have said, and that in turn requires trust and engagement. It cannot speak truth to power unless it has earned and maintained the trust of the membership by providing objective advice for the common good. There are many elements which enhance engagement, and we could come back to this issue if requested. Nonetheless, legitimacy also requires consonance, a word used in 2010, between the expectations and the legal framework. This was the argument used when the new integrated surveillance decision required new emphasis, including on spillovers from economic and financial policies and integration of bilateral and multilateral surveillance. Crises often spur changes to keep the IMF relevant to its purposes. The most obvious example is the Second Amendment to the Articles following the breakdown of the Bretton Woods arrangement, but there are many others, including the development of new instruments, the introduction of the FSAP, and following financial crisis in the 1990s. But good leadership has also been instrumental in anticipating a vastly changing world. In this category, I would place the IMF role in quickly adapting to help the former Soviet Union, and the missionary zeal, those were the words of Harold James, making the IMF more relevant. Those are the words of Harold James in describing MD Michel Candace in forging consensus to help develop the concessional lending instrument for low-income countries, making the IMF more relevant to their needs. Significantly, this new aspect of the mandate aimed not just to strengthen the current country's balance of payments, but also later explicitly to reduce poverty and increase economic growth. This particular example, fully consistent with the overarching purposes of the IMF, provides clues for future possibilities. Slide 8. The huge increase in carbon dioxide emissions illustrates the urgent need to use and adapt the IMF mandate to anticipate a vastly changed world. The world is now left, after this huge increase since the Second World War, with a very high and rising level of atmospheric carbon, some 415 plus parts per million. Given the greenhouse effect, this level implies the world has only a small remaining carbon budget to spend before the long-term global temperature rises above 1.5 degrees. This in turn will be very harmful to biodiversity, but also potentially trigger more rapid release of greenhouse gases to make matters much worse. Estimates of when the carbon budget exhausted vary widely, but on some assumptions in only a handful of years. So slide 9, what can the IMF do? In any case, the next 25 years will see extraordinary upheaval. Whether the world through cooperation succeeds in mitigating the major risks, or whether it has to adapt to the consequences of not doing. Patterns of investment, consumption, trade, finance face major structural change. The IMF can do a very great deal with the existing mandate. For example, on pandemic response, the existing rapid financing instrument was triggered and provided much needed liquidity. Following the comprehensive surveillance review just finished, there's a substantial agenda, including spillovers and prioritizing large emitters. There's also a huge agenda on tax expenditure policy and on finance, enhancements to the FSAP, implications of the work of Mark Carney's task force. As mentioned earlier, successful traction of the IMF depends in part on the quality of advice and interactions, as well as the extent of engagements. There are many ways to accomplish this, some listed on that slide. On slide 10, focusing on climate change for a moment, the IMF could do much more in pursuing substantial priorities, all within this existing mandate. I highlight just 3. The IMF is in a unique position to analyse and make public the policy implications of limited global carbon budget and the effects of imminent exhaustion. Such analysis, for example, would speak truth to power on the failures of existing commitments to add up to the total deemed necessary by the UN process and expose the lack of transparency on the timeline to achieve long-term goals. This, of course, is already done to some extent, but I think it has to be highlighted. The IMF's advocacy of price mechanisms can help form private sector expectations that are critical to the successful green transition. The private sector will supply the vast majority of the needed investment in new energy supplies and in the transition. And the third suggestion is that a swift global energy transition should be aligned with the ability of developing countries in particular to access the energy they still require in order to grow, and the IMF can contribute to this global perspective. On slide 11, we look more at the country level engagement and the priorities there. Meeting climate change objectives per se is unlikely to be a main motivator for action. IMF teams in every country need to understand the incentives for the change for each country, and when drivers for economic growth, employment, energy provision, health outcomes, and revenue mobilization coincide with the green transition. This is how we may get some more success. Every Article 4 consultation should discuss and report on the country's green transition action plans, including the policies to implement and improve national plans for mitigation and adaptation. And finally, biodiversity is another vital global public good, and countries have committed to achieving certain goals. It can be macro-critical for some countries now and most in future, and spillovers through food prices and industries affect many and are clearly underestimated. There is no framework in surveillance similar to that yet for climate change, though discussions could still take place in consultations, which as with climate change can help convene relevant ministries and understand linkages. These activities could all be done with the existing mandate, but will require resources and expertise, and this should not be shied away from. Slide 12. I move now to 4 specific ideas for changes to the mandate. Idea 1 relates to surveillance. For all the happy talk of national and corporate pledges, the zeitgeist I mentioned, an IMF surveillance review is needed to provide a formal check on progress of the system, the Zeitgeber. Surveillance reviews are infrequent now, and another 5 years is far too long to wait. Interim annual limited green transitional surveillance reviews would include assessments of whether globally economic policies are on track to meet the global targets. These assessments, a more targeted and formal way of reporting to the board than regular analysis for the IEO fiscal and financial reports, would require the monitoring of agreed global benchmarks, reporting progress on meeting individual country commitments, and encouraging countries to have interim benchmarks defining credible paths to achieve their announced targets for 2030 or 2050. However, if there remains insufficient global traction on mitigation in particular, an early review of the integrated surveillance decision could be triggered with proposals to strengthen it. The trigger for such a review, a global benchmark, should be agreed in advance. A cautionary note: hasty moves to revisit surveillance decisions, which have often been very contentious and take a long time, can have unintended consequences and absorb political capital that could be spent elsewhere. Any change would need to be carefully considered and well planned to gain consensus, but it remains an important option. Slide 13. Idea 2 relates to lending. As we at CGD proposed, the IMF can introduce a new vaccine financing window into existing IMF facilities. It would provide immediate, unconditional financing to countries to fund the Multilateral COVAX initiative. This would help countries to use their collective clout to negotiate advanced purchases and higher vaccine production. This should have been done fully last summer. Such a mechanism can empower developing countries to finance themselves their needs without waiting a year or more for rich countries to decide finally to pledge sufficient grants, which still aren't available. It would supplant, not replace, but not await the efforts of other multilateral institutions. There are several possible ways of providing green finance for the green transition. The need is clearly urgent. Although the design could take various forms, the justification for such financing is clear, based on the balance of payments need, while undertaking policies to adjust the structure of the economy. The precedents of the Extended Fund Facility and the PIGT, the Policy Reduction and Growth Trust, are germane. There is ample precedent for new financing instruments. This in some ways is the most straightforward innovation, since new facilities and trusts, windows within facilities, change terms and length, and modifying the policies on the use of resources have been very frequent. In the present context, however, in this discussion with you, I was also struck that the language in Article 1 related to lending seems particularly relevant to rethinking or broadening the concept of prosperity to encompass not just material well-being, but also the well-being of the planet and all living things on it. I don't know whether such an interpretation is feasible or sensible, or whether it would require legal opinion or a board discussion. Sean, this one is clearly for you. Moreover, if resorting to, in the language of this part of this purpose, were interpreted to encompass meaning to continue to resort to measures destructive of national and international prosperity, would appropriate mitigation and adaptation strategies, if they continued and are inconsistent with global targets, be considered destructive to prosperity? Slide 14. The idea relates to the UN-IMF link. Indeed, there have been many ways in which the UN and the IMF are linked. And I notice in recent years, particularly the last year, in fact, there's an enormous amount of economic activity which the UN is doing, including for countries with natural resources and so on, extractive industries, and obviously looking at those who are suffering most from the climate change. The 1947 relationship between the UN and the IMF allowed each organization to present formal recommendations to the other, though not without reasonable prior consultation. I'm not sure that this has ever been used. In present circumstances, when international coordination on critical matters is fragile and accountability is diffuse, and the UN is involved in so many other new initiatives, I wonder whether it's possible to try to strengthen this or similar link. I have two ideas. First, the IMF could present a formal recommendation to the UN on an issue which is of concern. For example, the IMF might conclude that existing economic policies are inadequate for countries to meet the collectively agreed global mitigation targets set by the UN Framework Convention. Or two, individually announced NDCs do not add up to the global targets for commitments. and that as a consequence, the expected speed of exhausting the carbon budget pose threats to global prosperity with potential impact and disruption for the international monetary system. That's one suggestion. Second suggestion, UN resolutions on national and international security allow countries to notify the IMF and maintain restrictions for this purpose. The IMF, itself a member of the UN, is obliged to carry out the decisions of the Security Council and to have due regard for decisions under Articles 41 and 42 of the UN Charter. Since the existential threat of unmitigated climate change and of diminished biodiversity is analogous to a threat to international security, could a similar process oblige the IMF to approve certain restrictions on goods, services and capital? The aim of these changes would be to maintain the distinction between the economic and political mandates, increase the level of accountability for the IMF's technical analysis and for the UN's response to them, as well as for the UN judgments on global threats. Slide 15. IMF purposes have highlighted the expansion of trade and eliminating restrictions, and in its first 75 years, it's been characterized by the strong conviction in general of lifting trade and exchange restrictions to recover from the war and then to facilitate economic growth and development. Notable exceptions were approved for transitional arrangements and for security reasons as mentioned. It's been a retreat from this peak of the liberalization cycle, and restrictions are now contemplated or regulation increased for diverse reasons. Security, protection of local industries, greater security of supply chains is now an issue, countering money laundering, capital flow management measures, and also de facto restrictions have crept in through bilateral investment treaties and cross-default clauses. But in addition to these trends, I wondered whether the system of trade and exchange payments could change dramatically if other payments don't work quickly enough, if other policies don't work quickly enough. Carbon pricing, the domestic regulation approach, and domestic financial supervision are all now being pursued. But what if trade and exchange arrangements become an alternative policy tool to pursue national and international goals for the green transition? Related issues, of course, the impact of the EU's carbon border tax. So my fourth idea is that the IMF and the WTO should work together urgently to consider whether changes are needed in their policy frameworks to minimize the potential disruptions to trade and payments if there is a disorderly take-up of these restrictions, and to distinguish between those restrictions which may be deemed legitimate and those subject to approval and those that would not. So to conclude, the policies in international cooperation the past year in an area as conceptually straightforward as vaccine financing and distribution serves as a wake-up call on the state of international cooperation as we now turn to more complex and politically fraught issues. So my takeaways are the following. 1, risks are too serious to assume that the IMF mandate is fit for purpose to deal with immense challenges ahead. 2, given the time constraints, I suggest the IMF pursue a two-track approach. Without a change in mandate, it has an enormous, vital and urgent agenda which needs new resources and new expertise. At the same time, the relevance of the IMF mandate to its purpose should be reviewed urgently for new ideas and acted upon as quickly as possible. Finally, I've offered 4 ideas to consider on surveillance, lending, the UN-IMF link and restrictions. But this is meant as a start of a larger process where more ideas emerge from everyone. The IMF is set up to deal with the dilemma that policies for the global public good, in the interest ultimately of everyone, often do not align with perceived short-term national interest. Let's hope that the IMF takes a lead, leaves no option unexplored, and increases the chances that by 2045, the canaries will have outlasted the coal mines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to take over from here. And this was a terrific marathon, very detailed analysis of the issues at hand and some very thoughtful recommendations. We have 3 formidable discussants or even co-presenters. The first one is Sean Hagen, who we all know. He is now visiting professor of law at Georgetown University. And he was formerly the IMF's general counsel and the director of the legal department that was between a long stretch of time between 2004 and 2018. Sean, your thoughts on the mandate and John's views. Thank you.
So thank you. And John, thanks for that thoughtful presentation and for inviting me to comment on it. I think it's a really useful framing to talk about the challenges facing the fund in terms of the mandate of the IMF. Before I comment on your specific proposals, however, I just want to step back and define the concept of mandate for a second, because I think it's important. Lawyers tend to get hung up with definitions. So the term mandate is not a legal concept, but it is a concept that embraces two elements. The first is the fund's powers, as set forth in the Articles of Agreement. And as you pointed out, those powers, broadly speaking, include its regulatory authority, in particular surveillance, its financial powers, and thirdly, its ability to provide technical assistance. But then the question is, to what purpose are those powers to be used? And those purposes are set forth in Article 1, which you've identified. Now, I would agree with you that, the powers of the fund and the purposes for which they are to be exercised are broadly stated, have been broadly interpreted. However, they are not infinite. That's the first point that I would make. As you have pointed out, the powers were sufficiently constraining on the fund that the articles had to be amended over a number of years, 7 times. And for example, with the Second Amendment, it fundamentally changed the IMF's mandate, okay? The second point I would make is that the purposes, although broadly stated, also are limiting, which is that the fund may not use its powers for a political purpose, but only for an economic purpose. In other words, the IMF could not make the provision of IMF financial assistance conditional upon democratic reform. So we need to understand that there are limits to the fund's mandates. And the reason I make that point is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't change the mandate. It just means that if you want to change the mandate, you have to go through the process of an amendment of the Articles of Agreement. And that is a hassle. It's a time-consuming process because you have to go through Parliament. And the lawyers are always under pressure to avoid that by interpreting the provisions very broadly. But that's a problem because the amendment is a way of ensuring legitimacy because it requires the democratic process of the membership to basically approve changes. So you have to avoid excessively broad interpretation, which would undermine the legitimacy of the fund, okay? So those are some general points. Okay, so getting to your proposals. First, I don't have an issue at all with what you've talked about in terms of surveillance, except that I don't think your proposal requires any change to the IMF's mandate. Once you've determined that surveillance really does affect the prospective balance of payments or domestic stability of its members, then the fund not only can, but the fund should, with respect to climate change, intervene more aggressively in the policies of members. And this is a point that we've discussed extensively at the fund, which is, and it fits into a broader theme, which is the fund has increasingly looked at economic performance, John, through a longer time lens, not just macroeconomic developments over a 1 to 3 year period, but over a longer time period, and has decided that these longer term factors are core to the fund surveillance, whether it be inequality, climate change, or corruption, which, as you know, is one issue where in the short term corruption may not have an observable impact on a country, but in the long term it does. And now the fund has a robust policy in that area. So I don't see an issue in basically having climate change become an increasingly core part And I definitely would not describe it, John, as a change in the fund's mandate. It may require new decisions by the IMF, but we don't call a new decision a change in the fund's mandate. Okay. Second, financing. Again, to the extent to which there is a recognition that there is a link between balance of payments problems and vaccine shortages and expenditures needed by countries to purchase vaccines, I really don't see an issue with having basically financing provided under the RFI or the RCF. I don't see that. These instruments were intended to basically address emergencies arising from either exogenous shocks or natural disasters. There's a number of ways you could describe the pandemic. The point that I would make here, and this is where there's an important caveat, is the issue will be on access, which is the RFI, for example, has access limits. And the idea is that reflects the idea that you are not imposing any conditionality. If you continue to increase the access limits under the RFI, and you basically do not have any form of conditionality, there is a question as to consistency with the IMF's mandate because of the absence of safeguards. But where you draw that line is clearly an issue of judgment. When it comes to basically financing for climate change, here I think there is an issue. I think there's no, I think it's easy to do under the PRGT, in as much as the concept of protracted balance of payments problem that was formulated as a result of the ESAF and the SAF, and that is embedded in the special provisions of Article 5, Section 12, really allow developing countries to use fund financing in a program where it is the program that almost generates the balance of payments need. In other words, they're starting from a low equilibrium where they may not have a balance of payments problem, but in order to grow and develop, they need to make those expenditures, and that actually creates the balance of payments need, and the fund finances that. That may be a workable approach with respect to, expenditures for climate change. It's not so clear to me how it works, however, under the general resources account, because the general resources account, the program is designed to resolve the balance of payments problem. And so the question will be, what is the balance of payments need, and how are the measures resolving that balance of payments problem? And I'm sure that this is being given a great deal of thought within the institution. I would just say that I see more flexibility in the PRGT than I do in the general resources account. The UN IMF link, I think trade is the next one. No, so which one was the third one, John? Was it?
It was the IMF UN link.
Okay, so the IMF here, unfortunately, I'm going to have to disagree with you. The IMF is not a member of the UN. It is not bound by UN decisions. The IMF, as an independent organization, pays due regard to UN Security Council resolutions in its policies, including on its policies of approval of exchange restrictions that have been imposed pursuant to UN Security Council resolutions. So that could be done. With respect to UN Security Council resolutions that which pertain to climate change, the issue for you, John, is not whether the IMF thinks that's within its mandate, but whether the UN Security Council believes that climate change is an event that is essentially within its jurisdiction under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which constrains the UN Security Council to deal with threats to international peace and security. Okay, which are generally of a political nature. There are instances where the resolutions have addressed economic issues, but John, that's not an issue for the IMF. That's an issue for the UN, okay? The final point I would make on trade is that, again, to the extent to which you see that there may need to be a different class of restrictions that will need to be approved by the fund because of these restrictions are otherwise considered to be providing a public good that is consistent with the IMF's purposes. Again, that can be done without a change of the mandate. You would need to modify the fund's policies on approval. However, that assumes that as a general principle, you still think that trade liberalization is good, because that's what's in the articles. And that therefore this is another set of exceptions to that rule, but you would not be reversing that presumption of general acceptability. If that's the case, change the policy, you don't have to change the mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I found that very, very clear. I may have a question at the end. And that, John, do you want to come back or move to Harold? John?
Sorry, I lost you there, Nicoletta.
I mean, do you want to, do you want to come back now, or shall we collect?
I can come back on a couple of these things. First of all, I think, thank Sean very much for that. I mean, these are, obviously he's the expert on these issues. What on the concept of mandate, I realize is that the articles is the major legal framework for it. I took a slightly broader view of the concept of mandate to mean the set of policies. So when you have a change in a surveillance decision, for example, it's a sufficient change in fund's policy to go to the board, which changes its overall mandate with a broader sense that I meant it. So I meant it in broader sense than the strict, narrow legal definition of the under the articles. But in substance, I didn't disagree with anything he said on that. On the access limits for the vaccine financing, in fact, in our proposal, we suggested quite limited access limits for the very reason that it gives, if you go too far with it, I think it does start to raise questions of the safeguards. But when it's linked to funds that could go to COVAX for this specific multilateral purpose, there is also some assurance given there, apart from the general cooperation with the IMF, that I think, given the risk to the fund of not doing such work, I think is an acceptable risk and that has the safeguards. But of course, that is a view which the board would have to take. On the issue of the UN-IMF link, well, I'm sorry if I got wrong the mention. I read which I'll go back and read again now, the document from the history of the 1947 agreement. But I thought it did interpret the fund's membership. But the important point is that I do agree that it would be a change in the diplomacy, if you like, between the UN and the IMF, because it's the UN that would actually have to make those changes to make this kind of link of recommendations and receiving them and having resolutions work. But if things get very serious, I don't think, at least conceptually, one shouldn't see how one couldn't deepen the links with the UN on an issue of such global importance and risk. And that's why I raise it. I think I'm very aware that these are extremely difficult and difficult legal and diplomatic issues. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. Sean again, and I would now move to Harold James, Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton University and the IMF's historian. Harold, your views.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you, and thank you, John, for a terrific presentation and a very, very thoughtful discussion of the global goods that should be at the center of our discussion and at the center of the IMF's mission. It's really great to be with you. Maybe Prakash, you could share the slides that I had. I had a few slides to talk me through this.
Just give me a minute.
Yeah, absolutely fine. So the first issue that I think came out very clearly was whether you really need a new mandate or whether the mandate is flexible or not. And that was really extensively discussed by Sean already. I mean, in fact, if you move to slide 2 now, the story of Bretton Woods is exactly that. That it sets out a very, very broad kind of vision, and a lot of things have been done by just reacting quickly to policy, and they're perfectly in frame in line with the mandate. And so in the 1970s, if you look on the second slide, I'm sorry. I should have said something else. Yes, but it requires really, and I think that's the fundamental part of the vision of 1944, that it requires some kind of general acceptance, general consensus, and some people call it an epistemic community. Some people call it a normative consensus. John was thinking it as a normative consensus, and that was very, very powerful. At Bretton Woods, there was a real belief that the catastrophes of the interwar period shouldn't be repeated, and there's a substantial alignment, and really it's a story between the United States and the United Kingdom. There are 44 countries, or 45 countries if you include the Danish representatives at Bretton Woods. But fundamentally, it's two countries that are really talking about this and generating this normative consensus. And they're personified by these extraordinarily gifted figures, Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes. But there's a reason, I think, why it's not likely to be repeated, to have a kind of new Bretton Woods. And people have been calling for decades now for a new Bretton Woods. Every time there's a new problem, there's a call for a new Bretton Woods. But I think the story of Bretton Woods is, and the success of Bretton Woods is really generated by the particular urgency of it in the summer of 1944. So it's occurring just after the Normandy landings. The Allied troops are moving forward very quickly into France. There's a really very, very strong likelihood that the European war, at least, would be over by the autumn of 1944. And it's essential to have a mechanism in place before that happens. So there's some immediate time pressure there that is generating the push to get a result very, very quickly. I just gave an example here on this slide of the way in which you can adjust and adapt very quickly to circumstances. In the 1970s, after the breakdown of the power value system, and in the middle of the oil shock, and in big chaos with a mixture of inflation and recession, stagflation, and a particular problem about the financing of oil imports. And so it has very strong analogies, I think, to the current situation, in that the richer countries can manage somehow. They've got more fiscal space to deal with oil imports, but poorer countries, the equivalent of what we now call emerging countries, didn't have that room. And they need assistance, and the fund responded very, very quickly with the oil facilities. So the oil facilities don't require the Second Amendment, and they're, I think, absolutely analogous to the story that John had of financing the vaccine. If you could move to the next slide, and I think this is really the core of the story that John is thinking about, and I thought of it really in terms of 4 T's. First of all, teeth. What teeth are there in surveillance? we know very, very well that the fund has an enormous amount of teeth in dealing with program countries. But when it comes to non-program countries, and in particular to big countries, and if you see that very clearly, I think, on John's chart of the carbon emissions, the story is there that very few big countries, China or India in Asia, are pushing the growth of carbon emissions. So what kind of teeth does the fund really have in those cases? It's actually hard to think of real teeth. And so I think you want to go for what you describe as traction. And traction is, I think, a little bit less than teeth. You can't really penalize, except, I wondered when John was thinking in the last slide of using exchange and trade controls as a way of responding to climate change. I thought that would really open all kinds of Pandora's boxes. That if you think that China is not doing enough to mitigate its carbon emissions, does that allow you to impose trade or payment sanctions on China? I think if you start to go on that track, you really blow up the system, and it would be very, very difficult to think of that. So traction, I think, is more about persuasion and getting the alignment of the views of officials. And I think it relies then, if you just move to the third of my T's, on tracking. And that I think is the core of the position, and it's very, very central to the mandate. Indeed, if you go back to the early history again, it's quite interesting that the fund is about providing data and making data available. And the reluctance of the Soviet Union, and in the end, its failure to ratify the Articles of Agreement, it was at Bretton Woods, but the failure of the Soviet Union to ratify the Articles of Agreement was about the requirements to provide information to the fund. And when two Soviet influenced countries in Eastern Europe, Poland and Czechoslovakia, were members in the 1940s, one was expelled and one withdrew because of exactly this issue of providing information. They didn't want to provide information. And so getting a hand on information, providing data, making data widely available, I think is absolutely at the center of the original vision of the fund, and should be in the light of the new public goods that we're thinking about. So you can think of the fund, and it's been working on this. Obviously, this is also a long theme. It's been working on this since the 1990s with the data dissemination standards and so on. But what I think is important there is that this data is really up to date, and that might be the moment that you want to rethink whether it's really the right thing to do this in biannual reports in the WEO or in the Fiscal Monitor or in the Financial Stability Report, or whether you don't want really continuous data so that you can see exactly where problems are emerging. And we've seen over the last year that it's really important to have a grip on up-to-date data to see what's happening with the pandemic, for instance. We have countries that think that they've dealt satisfactorily with the pandemic, where suddenly it becomes a big problem again. So up-to-date information, and I think exactly the same applies to climate change. And so my final T is teaching. I mean, I think that's really the best that you can do after you've done the really hard work of getting the data going, to then illuminate why it's important and what kind of responses are really required. And then finally, I wanted to come back to an issue that is, I think, at the core of the discussion that Sean had at the end and John responded to. What's the relationship with the UN? What's the relationship between politics and economics? And that's actually, on one level, really impossible to answer. There are political things are economic and economic things are political. And the reason that that wasn't particularly an issue in 1944 and 1945 was that there was this remarkable parallelism between the UN Security Council and the 5 largest quota holders of the fund. And so, the whole issue of whether the fund should take instructions from the UN or not didn't really arise, because the governance institutions were really aligned with each other. Because the 5 largest quota holders were originally going to be the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, and France and China. And the Soviet Union never ratified the Articles of Agreement, and China had the revolution and then was represented until the 1970s by the Republic of China by Taiwan. So this beautiful symmetry was never really realized. At the time of the conference, in the opening address, Secretary Morgenthau said, prosperity like peace is indivisible. We can't afford to have it scattered here or there among the fortunate, or to enjoy it at the expense of others. And I think that really gets to the point that you can't have just one country being peaceful, and you can't have one country being prosperous. And the pandemic highlights that very much, that we can't be safe if there are a large number of countries which have a high level of disease and infection, and where virus mutations are constantly threatening the rest of the world. I think that this is a real problem. It relates to climate change. It relates to corruption as well. I mean, corruption is clearly a political issue. It's very, very difficult to say that corruption is not a political issue, and accusations of corruption are part of the day-to-day politics of a country. I mean, we see it in the United States. That kind of language is everywhere. And so getting into the discussion of corruption, I think, is really a problematic one. I think it's also problematic because that's the last of these points on security. Climate change is also a distributional question. There are some countries that are clearly much more severely affected by climate change than others, and some countries, particularly in the north, in the northern hemisphere, in Canada or the Russian Federation, may in some ways, in a short-sighted way, see substantial economic gains out of climate change because of the lengthening of the growing season. But that's a short-sighted view. But it means that any kind of abatement issues on climate change are going to really throw up big distributional issues. And so, that makes me think, isn't the fundamental issue that is really being addressed there the question of whether the Security Council, or indeed whether the quotas of the fund don't need to be radically rethought. And the last slide, I just had a kind of thought that I took from the assessment of GDP at the moment. The 5 largest countries of the world, if you go by the 1944 parallel, would be the United States, China, Japan, Germany, and India. Or if you don't think that having Germany is a good idea, you could count the European Union as a country. Either way, you would really get, I think, to something that is reflective of what the reality looks like. And I think that kind of adjustment needs to be made on the security level issue, the Security Council level as well. So I'll leave it at that and happy to discuss this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Harold. John, do you have any reaction to Harold's points? Muted.
I would just very quickly to not take up much time. I just want to come back on one point. I'm not specifically advocating that the trade and exchange restrictions should be used, but I'm just saying that I think the fund and the WTO have to be well prepared for the fact that this could well be used as a set of policies that we have to respond to make sure it doesn't disrupt the progress that's been made and the patterns of trade and payments that we're now accustomed to. Because if these other main policy instruments of pricing, domestic regulation, if you don't want to be direct pricing, or financial supervision, if they start not to work, then I think countries may well revert to trade and payments restrictions, and we better face up to how that will be dealt with. That was the main point I would make at this point.
Well, that's great. And now we have with us Bessma Momani, who is Professor of Political Science and Assistant Vice President in the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI. Bessma, the floor is yours. Some comments and views. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure other people have great questions for John as well. I really appreciated the presentation, and perhaps I'm going to sort of, I want to help. So in the kind of advice and the thoughts I'm going to have is really about how can we move this forward? And by that, really suggesting that, of course, there may be some impediments. So let's think about ways of moving beyond it. I mean, you start off with this point that there is an alarming failure of international cooperation before our eyes. And I think that's absolutely correct, and doing a lot of work on that. But I think we also have to understand what it is, why. Why do we have a lack of international cooperation? Because that's going to be the challenge, I think, in also convincing from the bottom up people and policymakers to actually action what you're talking about. I'm mindful of the UN Secretary General, who had this great sort of encapsulation of what's going on. He says there's a trust deficit disorder. And that's really important, because I think there's going to be an uphill battle getting countries and people on board. Obviously, some of this is what we see with populism and identity politics. For those of us in political science field of study, we see this basically as a challenge to experts. There's a challenge of scientists. There's a challenge to policymakers because of that loss of trust. So politicians, and I think at the end of the day, we are talking about people who have to implement this or be on board, are going to be very skeptical about getting people from the bottom up to support. I think that's something I'll pick up in a second, because I think there are some silver linings here, including some countries that will be allies in wanting to move this forward. But I think I'm going to caution you that there's going to be a lot of objectioners, if you will. I like the idea of you pointing out that we need new IMF staff, because I think in previous examples, and really happy to see two of our great historians of the IMF here, but getting IMF staff on board and not seeing this as mission creep is a big hurdle. It can be, what you don't want is sort of this to be taken on by the executive board, but not be internalized and owned, right? We use that language of country ownership, but we also need the staff to own this. And that is going to be a normative change. And I think all of us may be concerned with climate, but you are going to hear, why the IMF? Why isn't it this at the World Bank? Is this the right organization to be kind of pushing this forward? So thinking about that, and I just recall, the fears of the IMF staff when previous kinds of broadening of mandate. We saw this with the attempt to fight poverty, right? And then increasingly on gender. The feeling that, this is really mission creep. So I think that's going to be an important part of kind of changing the conversation, is sort of why. Why does this belong in the IMF's mandate and not in another organization, for example? I think this idea, you said that really, I love this point, but this idea this requires trust and engagement for the IMF. I think that's a really important point that you noted. Certainly, I think on climate, you are going to hear a lot of developing countries very critical of this proposal, right? And we've seen this in climate politics always often. It's developing countries saying to the developed countries, you know, basically you're saying do as we say, not as we do, right? Because the history of from pollution to environmental degradation has often been mostly coming from the West or from developed countries. So that's going to be an important part of the convincing process, if you will, particularly politically. I mean, on the bright side, and I said there are silver linings, both China and India are on board. And that's really important because both countries are really grappling with the effects of climate change. And so those are going to be really important constituents that will be very much willing to push this forward. I would say on the other hand, and even thinking about the United Nations, countries like Russia and other energy producers are not going to be on board. I think you're going to have a very difficult time, even if this goes to the IMF, of countries like Russia and other oil producers supporting this. And of course, at the UN Security Council in particular, Russia has a veto power. So there's going to be a problem there, I think, in getting this done. The other thing I was going to ask, you know, you talked about, again, staff and staff expertise, which is absolutely right. I'm curious to know, where do you see this in terms of the surveillance process? So is this something that's going to be integrated in, say, Article 4s? Or is this going to be sort of a broader kind of World Economic Outlook type document, if you will? So I'm curious to know where you position it. And if I may make a recommendation here, is to integrate it in the area departments. I think if we try to sort of create something, you know, if eventually this proposal gets adopted and it's put in its own sort of separate department organization within the IMF, you're really going to see a lot of siloed behavior, and it won't be integrated in the way that I think you would envision, really having it fundamentally part of the lending process. So I would really encourage that thinking about how does this become a part of everyday practice, right? I mean, that's kind of where some of the gender surveillance, if you will, kind of was hoping to go, that it would be part of the way that missions were carried out. It would be really fully integrated in the area departments. And I hope that's where you see this really going. What else? I mean, I think you've been talking a lot about kind of getting countries on board. And as I said, you know, talking about getting staff on board, but I'm wondering whether or not this can be done through incentives. How do we, you know, rather than punishing, right? I mean, the concept of teeth is a punishment, so to speak. It's more about sticks. How do we sort of incentivize? What are the ways that can be, you know, motivating, particularly debtors to pick this up? And that really brings to the other issue, which is, you know, it's fair to say that mostly the creditors at the IMF are the most kind of willing to adopt this norm. I mean, their sort of commitment to climate change is probably far more than I would argue in the debtors. And that is something that I think needs to be sort of reconciled. I mean, how do you push forward a norm? Because it is a norm. I mean, climate action is a norm, just like all the other norms that, you know, take time to be really owned by not just certainly IMF staff, which is very important because that doesn't work if they don't believe in it, but certainly by the countries themselves. And I will stop there. I have lots of other stuff I'd add, but I think in the interest of time, I'd like to just leave it at that. Thanks, John.
Thank you to you also, Bessma. And John, would you like to respond to Bessma now before we go into the Q&A?
I notice there's a lot of Q&As, so I'll leave that, and the one or two I would like to come back to there. But thank you very much to all three commentators. I will just pick up on one point that Bessma made, which I think is very important. You asked about how you'd envisage this to be built in, but of course that's not my responsibility anymore. But I would strongly urge, as you say, that this is built into the regular Article 4 consultations. I mean, the latest surveillance review, I've read these papers now as an outsider, has made strong progress on things that need to be done in Article 4s and in multilateral surveillance and in bringing them together, which is great. But until you have the position where each IMF team going to every country, whether it's a priority one or not, is fully steeped in these issues, integrates all of the issues of biodiversity and climate into the real sector, financial, fiscal and external sectors in the classic model of the four-person IMF team, and you really work together on the linkages between them and what this means for policy and having good dialogue with the authorities, then I don't think you're going to get very far. So I think that is an absolutely essential thing. It's going to be quite expensive. To answer just, I saw one question as about, well, why the IMF? And I think it's just essential to carry out what the IMF needs to do. It does not take away anything that other people have to do, including colleagues across the street who really do have an awful lot to do and need to work together very closely. But this is such a huge agenda. It's not a question of one doing it and the other not. Both need to be doing this full blast.
There are some questions in the chat. John, I'll invite the people that asked them to come to the fore if they want to put the question directly. So Petya,
it's a question of how much you want to do it on time. I see one or two questions on vaccine.
Yes, why don't you want to go those directly? You can read them in the chat, so that'd be great. Thanks.
Some of them may not all, but on vaccine financing, I mean, there's this distinction between whether or not you have a separate window or whether it can be handled under the existing rapid financing instrument and credit facility. And I think when we looked at this, we felt that there is a very special need, which basically hinges on timeliness, that the major issue looking back was like the major mistake of not just of the fund but of everyone with hindsight was that when this very innovative idea of COVAX coming together to put together developing countries collective clout to be able to negotiate for advanced purchases of vaccines, they put out a bid for financing which was not met, but it followed the old model where you go around asking donors to provide money, and some pledges came, some didn't. This idea is that the countries themselves would be empowered, in developing countries would be empowered to have the resources immediately available then in order to make the advanced purchases so that production could be ramped up, because the pharma companies would have the commitment to be able to go ahead and increase production at an earlier stage. So the real critical question is timing. And now, if you countries have to wait until they get the pledges from other countries, some of them, of course, have their own resources, others are worried about how that would be used, you miss that issue. So it's not as though money from the SDR allocation when it comes, or reserves, or the rapid financing as was distributed couldn't be used for this, but it's the essential coordination of a very time-limited call by COVAX. We need the money in our account by a certain date, and that's why we give the commitment to pharma companies to increase production with the help of governments. And if you miss that time, you keep getting this endless spinning out of the process, which we're now seeing over a year and a half, when I fear this pandemic is not over. So fixing that part of the toolkit to make sure this never happens again, and in fact is available for the second part of this pandemic, is why we push this issue.
There's also another question, this time by Rex Gosh, partly on vaccines. Rex, do you want to ask yourself quickly, or do you want me to read it? It basically says.
Yeah, well, it was less a question, I think, but more an issue of, leaving aside the legal aspect. We have often been confronted with the question of our expanding mandate. Mm-hmm. And I think the answer has been that when there is a macro stabilization or external financing aspect to it, whether it's low-income countries, transition economies, etc., we have a useful role to play. And typically, without amending the articles, we have managed to carve out that role for ourselves. So kind of going forward on climate change issues, again, or vaccines, when there is that macroeconomic aspect to it, we should be able to step up to the plate without encroaching on others' territories and within our kind of mandate and our expertise. So I just wanted to hear from the discussants whether they kind of agree with that view or feel that we should go beyond that because climate change is so important, for example.
John, do you want to take this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I see the relationship to the vaccines. Clearly, the fund is not buying the vaccines or distributing them or setting up the hospitals or anything. It's really still a process where it goes through the government to go immediately to COVAX to get it. So I think that stays clearly within its lane and doesn't get into where others should be doing it. But on the climate, I just see that it's such that transformations in these structural transformations in almost every economy in the world is parallel to a lot of the structural adjustment that we were thinking of when extending the facilities for an EFF, even with the general resources account, in order to allow change to take place that would otherwise have severe balance of payments needs. So I think I understand that Sean mentioned that it's more difficult, a little trickier to argue for the GRA than it is for the trust, where you have the separate provisions. But I still think that it fits firmly within the fund's broad mandate in the way I've been mandate, the broader sense of the mandate, that you could be using this for climate change purposes.
We have, maybe we can get a couple more questions. One, Sean also might be able to address this from Torsten Ehlers. In the past, what has allowed a broader interpretation of the IMF's mandate? Sean was telling us that several occasions that happened, and in particular, has there typically been a need to gather analytical evidence on the link to, for instance, balance of payment problems, given our Article 1, or would the IMF board have the freedom to decide without believing that such a link is plausible, even if enshrined in its mandate? So, don't know if anybody wants to get this.
Sean, do you want to take that?
Examples of broader interpretation of the mandate.
Well, I mean, I think the board is responsible for interpreting the Articles of Agreement and therefore interpreting the breadth of the IMF's powers. And, there have been circumstances where the board has interpreted the existing powers as being adequately broad to encompass the IMF doing new activities. The board does not make these decisions on its own, however. The board basically relies on the technical analysis of the managing director and her staff. So normally these are supported by adequate analysis and evidence. And I think that's pretty central to the fund's own credibility and legitimacy. But as I said, I think that you have to be aware that while there is flexibility and breadth, there are limits, and the fund needs to acknowledge those.
There's one more question, maybe also possibly directed to Sean, or also maybe John has studied this. Why did the fund back off the pursuit of an expanded multilateral mandate in 2010-11 in favor of the ISD? And is the IMF largely content with member countries' provision of data, including on large companies? So this is about choice of the ISD as opposed to expanded mandate.
So, I mean, I think I understand where this question is coming from.
Let me clarify if you want.
Yeah, I think I understand where this is coming from. Back in 2010, as a result of the financial crisis, there was a sense that the fund basically needed to make spillovers a central part of surveillance. And there was a problem because essentially some of those spillovers were spillovers from monetary policy, for example, in the United States, that was appropriate for the United States. And basically the fund recognized that it would be difficult to fit that type of spillover analysis into an Article 4 absent amendment to the articles. And actually, you will look at the record, the fund considered an amendment to the articles that would bring that type of analysis right into surveillance, but the membership did not want to go there. The membership did not want to amend the articles, so what we ended up with was a integrated surveillance decision, which made spillovers a discussion of spillovers, at least in cases where the policies were appropriate for domestic stability. In those cases, a procedural obligation, but not a substantive obligation. And that was the compromise that was basically the basis for the ISD. But the staff had more ambitious ideas, but as is often the case, that ambition was not met in a positive way by the board because they did not want to have to go through the process of amending the Articles of Agreement.
I don't see any more questions. I had a question myself, which, I guess I'll throw there. We have a minute. So, but given the focus and the link with the balance of payments and the fact that climate change is a phenomenon that develops itself over time in the future, some of it is, of course, very current. There are countries already well in the midst of it. I mean, could all of you think that the interpretation of the mandate be extended in terms of, the expectations on balance of payments crisis? I mean, this is, of course, very uncertain terrain, but we do know that, for example, on imports of food, some countries are now completely dependent on imports. And if you match that with population growth and demographic projections, we do know with almost probability one, these countries will incur severe food shortages in the next 10 to 20 years. And that will, most likely lead to severe stress on balance of payments. So there's a sense in which the actions done now will prevent those crises down the line. Is there a role within the mandate to justify, like we did, international law? We at some point preemptive war became part of the toolkit. Can we extend the mandate to be preemptive on balance of payment crisis? Because this is the only way I think we can act on climate, is to act now to avoid a deterioration of planetary conditions down the line. Is that something which is totally out of beam or could be contemplated given the dynamics of this planetary problem, or we need to stick to the current time?
I would argue that in fact, in some ways, obviously this would need legal and obviously board agreement, but in some ways we've already crossed that bridge in other facilities. I mean, the idea that you'd be supporting countries way back in terms of dismantling commodity boards, liberalizing trade and so on. So the balance of payments need was not evident at that very moment when the program is put together. So it's almost a kind of potential balance of payments need. It can be protracted. It's not always in the case where you're in crisis, in balance of payments crisis at this moment. So, and without going to the exact legal language of that, I think the substance of it is that that is very much an area which should be discussed in this present context, and in fact would be the justification for being able to argue that structural change that's needed, which would have potential balance of payments consequences, could be funded by the IMF. I mean, it certainly, as Sean said, fits very clearly, in my view, into the PIGT or to any other trust which is set up, which presumably the board could agree to do if they felt that the GRA didn't quite make the cut. So, I mean, I think that is a very important discussion which will have to take place, and in my view, should take place very quickly.
If there are no other reactions, I think we would like to thank you all from the IEO for this timely, key, and very illuminating